Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm so pleased to be here with you in the Brookings Public Library to talk about the power of objects and 4 ways that they can bring your fiction to life. Um, I am Ellen Baker, and I'm just glad you're here. I'm guessing it means that you are a fiction writer and serious about learning how to use objects in the craft of writing. So let's get started. So here's a little roadmap for the session, a quick preview of the points I'm going to be talking about today. I am going to talk about the 4 things that objects can do within a novel first. And these are: objects can inspire or be at the center of stories, they can let you play with time, they can help bring your characters to life, and they can make your fiction seem like it really happened. Second, we're going to talk about how to make them do it. I'll share my process for making sure that the objects in your novel are accomplishing all that it's possible for them to accomplish, and how you can give an object its own story arc within the larger arc of the novel. So we'll get into this in just a minute, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. So as Deanna said, I grew up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and finally right here in Brookings, where I attended my last 2 years of high school, and I now live on the coast of Maine. I'm a former museum curator, a former bookseller, an INFP, a Reiki healer, an editor, a mindset coach, a traveler, a lover of black tea, dark chocolate, and Sauvignon Blanc, and mom to one spoiled kitty named Moxie. And I'm also the award-winning best-selling author of 3 upmarket historical novels published by Mariner, HarperCollins, and Random House, with a 4th one scheduled for publication in summer 2026 by Mariner. Here are some of the accolades that my earlier books received, and some recent blurbs for The Hidden Life of Cecily Larsen, and some places where it was a top pick of the season. And it was also in the People magazine and the Indie Next list. So next I'm going to tell you, I have been where you are, wanting to be a writer. From the time I was this little, I wanted to be a writer. Being a novelist was all I really wanted to do. I wrote stories throughout my childhood, but as I reached college, I told myself that trying to be a writer was impractical. I studied psychology and American studies and told myself I'd better get a real job. Still, I wrote and wrote and wrote, and I read and read. And in my mid-20s, I queried a couple of dozen agents trying to get representation for the 3rd novel I'd written, and I didn't succeed. Even then, I made the impractical decision to leave my museum job and work part-time at an independent bookstore so I could devote more time to my writing. And by the time I was 30, I had written my 4th manuscript, and the 4th one was a charm. I got a literary agent through a query letter and a 2-book deal with Random House. Keeping the House was published in 2007, and my next novel, I Gave My Heart to Know This, was published in 2011. After a decade plus of hard work, my dream had definitely come true. But the next decade was full of challenges. I rewrote my next novel about 8 times over about 10 years. It didn't sell. I loved that novel, but I had to admit that it just wasn't its time, and I set it aside. I thought about giving up, but I realized that my dream had never changed, and so in 2021, I wrote a brand new novel. In 2022, I got a new literary agent, again through querying, and finally, in February 2024, The Hidden Life of Cecily Larsen was published by Mariner Books. So during all those years of rejection and setbacks, I had to really, really believe in the importance of my dream of being a novelist. And in part for that reason, and in part because of my lifelong interest in psychology, I studied and got certified as a mindset coach. So now, when I'm working with clients and students, I generally weave everything I teach about writing in with mindset tools and techniques which serve to both notice how the thoughts you're thinking affect your experience and what you're able to accomplish, and also accesses portions of the dreaming mind to enhance the creative process. You'll notice that I talk a lot about dreams and sensory memory, even when I'm talking about how to use objects in your fiction. So now that you know all about me, let's jump in. The first way that you can use objects in your stories is the most obvious on its surface, to inspire or be at the center of them. We're going to talk about how to not only implement this idea, but also take it a lot deeper. So for me, this idea originates a very long time ago. When I was growing up, my family lived 7 miles north of a little town in northern Minnesota. And when I got old enough to come into town regularly for preschool, my parents would always drive the same route. There was a particular house that we would drive past where my parents told me there had been a fire. And as they told it, a woman had been able to get out of the house initially, but then she decided to go back in to get a treasured set of dishes that she couldn't bear to lose. And unfortunately, she couldn't make it back out of the house and she died. And I'm sure my parents probably told this to impress, fire safety upon me. Or maybe they made it up because when I asked them about it more recently, they didn't remember the story. Or maybe I made it up looking at this house. But whatever the case, it obviously made a huge impression on me. I can still picture that woman as I envisioned her then. And I always imagine her coming out of that house with smoke billowing behind her and a set of dishes clutched in her arms. She's wearing a skirt and an apron, something like what my grandma used to wear. And the wind is blowing her hair. So it seems from a young age, I was already trying to rewrite stories and imagine happy endings. But whether or not this story is true, to me it illustrates a great deal about the meaning of things, especially as that meaning relates to and impacts the stories we imagine. Things, objects, are reminders of who we are and of our own histories. And without histories, or as they say in the museum world, provenance, things typically mean or are worth very little. If you've watched Antiques Roadshow, you know exactly what I mean. That unsigned painting that can't be proved to be the work of a particular artist is worth thousands less than a signed work. A jumpsuit that Elvis wore takes on meaning that an impersonator just does not have. So I remember an episode of Antiques Roadshow that brought me to tears years ago. A woman presented an old military coat that her aunt had had in the attic for decades. It was really old, dating back to Revolutionary times, and yet somehow the fabric still seemed to retain the shape of the man who had worn it. It was even stained with his sweat. And now here it was, reduced to just an object, worth thousands because it had a particular type of Vermont buttons, and because it was in such unusually good condition. But no one knew the name of the man who'd worn it, what his dreams had been, or how he'd felt while wearing that coat, and what had happened to him while he was wearing it, or after he'd finished wearing it. And that was what brought me to tears. And that's where we as novelists get to come in. We get to make up all those things. We get to look at an object and decide what its story is, and we get to create significance for the story of that object. We also get to decide what the person who interacted with that object felt and thought and experienced. We get to decide just where and how reality and fiction will intersect. If we want to, we can even place that object at the center of the story and explore what connections it created among people and across time. I recommend reading Geraldine Brooks's novel Horse for a really clear example of how she does this. And if you're trying to think of what to write your next novel about, ask yourself, what object do I know of that has enough substance on which to hang a whole novel-sized story? I recommend this question as a great place to start because using objects as inspiration, it turns out, is actually an easy way for us as writers to access not just that surface level of inspiration, what happened to the Revolutionary War coat, for example, but to access many layers of memory, human experience, and connection. More than any series of events or plot itself, this is the stuff that makes good fiction. To return for a second to the roadmap we started with as we continue, I'm going to show how imagining stories as inseparable from the objects that are in them and vice versa works as a multi-layered approach to bringing your fiction to life as we incorporate points 2 and 3 and travel all the way through to point 4, making your fiction seem more real. For now, let's start with an example of how you can access or unlock those deeper levels of memory, connection, and emotion as you're considering an object as inspiration. So this is a story about a time when I was working as the curator of a World War II museum. And one day, a woman came in with an object she wanted to donate. It was a brochure advertising the flatware manufacturer Oneida. I didn't see how this had much to do with World War II until she told me her story. During the war, she had moved from Wisconsin out to New York for a job working at the Oneida factory, which had begun manufacturing bayonets. One night, out there in New York, far from home, she was listening to the radio, and much to her surprise, she heard her husband, who was serving in the Navy, on a program, win a date with a Rockette. They were supposed to be, single to take part in that, she told me very quietly 60 years later. That marriage ended in divorce, and the woman returned home to Wisconsin. So now you see, the connection between the object and the story doesn't need to be direct. An object can inspire a memory that doesn't necessarily suggest itself at first glance. Oops. Okay. So to this woman, the whole memory of being young on her own, trying her best, and having her heart broken was all bound up in that brochure. And even though the object was 60 years old at the time she handed it to me and told me the story of its importance, the emotion that it signified was still fresh, and the experience she'd had affected the course of her whole life. From this one object, then, the novelist can actually imagine the entire arc and story of this woman's life. Now this brings us to the second way that you can use objects to bring your fiction to life, which is that objects let you play with time. There are 3 ways they can help with this. They can allow back and forth in time. They can signify and illustrate time periods. They can illustrate the passing of time. So let's take a look at how objects can do all these things. To start, let's take a look at the example object house. With houses, it's especially easy to notice the way that they and the objects within them so often outlast the span of one human lifetime and one human story, and thus provide connections among people and points of intersection for many life stories. The history or provenance of an object, in this case, begins to be the connection, whether within a family or among people who have one way or another across time shared the same space or the same object. Time then begins to lose its ability to constrain a story or a life. So you can see then how an object itself can become a vehicle to allow you, the writer, to go back and forth in time. This is the way I structured my first novel, Keeping the House, around the central object of a grand Victorian house. I also used objects to signify and illustrate both time period and character details, and to help me and the reader travel easily through time in scenes ranging from the 1890s, the 1910s, the 1940s war years, up to 1950. So let's take a closer look. In Keeping the House, my main character, Dolly Magnuson, is a 20-year-old bride in 1950 who has moved to Pine Rapids, Wisconsin with her new husband, Byron, who owns a Chrysler dealership. As Dolly discovers that making marriage work is much harder than it looks in the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, she becomes fascinated by the Mickelson House, an abandoned mansion which sits high atop the hill overlooking the town. The Lutheran Ladies' Aid quilting group, which Dolly has joined in an attempt to fit in, begins to beguile her with stories and gossip of the family that lived there. So I'm going to read you one paragraph to illustrate how I used objects to show Dolly's time period and her character. And this is right after her first meeting with the quilting group. Their first morning in Pine Rapids, Dolly and Byron had gone down to Ralston's Furniture and bought a modern table, red formica-topped, edged in stainless steel, for the kitchen. It came with 2 leaves and 6 metal chairs upholstered in red vinyl. It was at this table that they sat this evening over a supper of tuna noodle casserole with molded peach salad on the side. Dolly had felt too done in after the Ladies' Aid gathering to attempt anything more complex, though she had taken the time to adorn the table with a single red tulip from the side garden, placing it in a pewter bud vase that had been a wedding gift. She was pleased with the effect against the wallpaper. Plus, in the flaring white dress with red trim, she, too, matched the table setting perfectly. In a moment of inspiration, she had even kept on her frilly red half apron. A friend back in her hometown of Battle Point had thrown her a well-attended apron collection bridal shower, so Dolly owned an impressive variety of aprons, 19 in all, one to match nearly every one of her dresses, because she had read somewhere that nothing says happy home to a husband like his smiling wife in an apron and lovely dress bidding him come to the table where she has a colorful, balanced hot meal waiting. Despite the relatively humdrum tuna casserole, and even though the heat of the oven had made her sweat straight through her girdle, Dolly still thought she was a wife that Byron could be proud of. So Dolly's cookbooks and kitchen utensils, the Formica-topped kitchen table, the wallpaper, the aprons, and even the recipes she prepares are signifiers of her as a person and of her time and place. And they go further than that, too, to suggest her hopefulness and, in a certain way, the disappointment that looms. As the novel continues, and the quilting ladies tell Dolly more about the Michelson house and the family that lives there, Dolly begins to identify strongly with Wilma Michelson, the family matriarch, who gave up her study of the piano in 1896 to get married and had second thoughts ever since. And this is a picture I found that looks just like the way I imagine Wilma would look. So to create continuity and connections for the reader, despite all the moves I made back and forth in time, I used not only the house, but smaller objects within it. For example, in 1950, Dolly is cleaning the parlor in the Michelson house and thinking about her unsatisfactory marriage. And the paragraph reads, "She dusted off the stool and sat down at the piano, wondering if Wilma had sat here and taught her children to play. She hoped that after last night there might be a child growing inside her. She was certain she would stop picking fights with Byron if there was. If she had a baby, she was certain she would never want to fly away then." And the next chapter begins in March 1899, and it reads, "Seated at the piano in the parlor, Wilma held little Jack in her lap, wondering if the baby she was expecting would like music as much as Jack did. After Jack's birth and that dreadful Independence Day when she had fainted in the street, her loneliness for her piano had become so unbearable that on the 5th of July that year, she had dragged herself to the parlor and begun plunking out scales and minuets." So you can see how not only are the characters in the novel connected because of their dissatisfaction and their similar experiences, but time collapses because they're both seated at that same spot in the house. So I'll also give you an example here of how I used objects to illustrate the passing of time. In the first chapter of the novel, when newlywed Wilma first arrives in town in 1896, her brother-in-law, Gust, picks her up and her husband at the train station, and they drive along muddy roads pitted with stumps from there to the Michelson house. And this is how Wilma experiences that ride. She was not quite conscious of the few frame houses built upon the rising hill and hardly noticed a hopeful row of maple saplings. But suddenly she saw the house upon the highest hill overlooking a bend in the river. It was majestic, 3 stories tall, painted a tender dove gray, and trimmed in white. In the second chapter of the novel, Dolly walks the same route in 1950 on her way to her first quilting meeting, and the scene looks extremely different. She walks through a busy downtown and into an established neighborhood, and she's grateful for the shade of the tall maples that line the sidewalks. She sees the house sitting high atop the hill above the river like an aging queen on her throne, 3 stories of disintegrating dove gray, clapboard and melancholy stained glass, trimmed in an aged white. So already we get the sense that time hasn't been so good to the Michelson house. To show a slightly different way, you can use objects to illustrate the passing of time. In a scene that takes place in 1945, John Michelson is going out for a drive, that's Wilma's husband, and this causes him to reflect on the passing of time by recalling the ways that the objects around him have changed. He stumbled down the back porch steps, then tiptoed across the snow-speckled yard to the old carriage house that had, over the years, held his father's various lacquered buggies and sleighs, then his own first Model T, on up to when he had become a Packard man about 15 years ago. He supposed the kids' old bicycles would still be up in the rafters, though he had never looked for them. That was the thing with continuity. You took it for granted that nothing would ever change. You felt you didn't have to fight just to keep things the same, and you didn't find out how wrong you were until it was too late. So you can see here that these objects, the cars and the carriages and the bikes, are all imbued with quite a bit of emotional significance for this character as well. And that brings us to the third way that we can use objects in fiction to make it seem more real, and that is to make our characters come to life. So this can sometimes be a matter of simple costuming, as in the case of Dolly and her dress and her girdle and her aprons. Sorry, I'm not sure why that's happening. So you can all simple costuming, or on a deeper level, as we mentioned in the case of the Revolutionary War coat or the Oneida flatware brochure, it can also be a matter of conveying to the reader what objects are significant to that character and thus what matters to them on an emotional level. What are the memories they place the most stock in or hold most dear? So if you're working on a novel right now and you want to make your characters seem more real, ask yourself those questions. Using objects can also be a matter of giving your characters props that affect how they act in any given scene. For example, just as Dolly is starting to make progress in the house, the Mickelson's grandson, JJ, comes home unexpectedly and discovers her there. He's a charming but haunted World War II Marine veteran who lost his leg at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the objects that act as props and provide action and in some cases limitations for JJ, as well as define his character, are his Lucky Strike cigarettes and his prosthetic leg. Examples of the objects that signify and flesh out the character of JJ's grandma Wilma include her piano, her corsets, her fine dresses and shoes early on. And as she grows older, there's a book of matches with the logo for Granton's Muskie Lake Resort on it. There's her radio, her knitting needles, and her Victory Garden instructions and pickle jars. Each of the characters in the novel has their own significant objects. For Wilma's son Jack, there's his old hat and slippers he refuses to give up, and his pipes, and the photograph of his dead brother Chase that hangs on the wall of his home. For Dolly, there's her red lipstick and her cigarettes and aprons and vacuum cleaner and cookbooks and her little bungalow, and so on. So in order to help bring your characters to life, I encourage you to ask yourself these questions of each of them. What objects are significant to the character? How does this object affect their experience, if it does? And what does the object signify about who they are? As you work with objects in this way in your fiction, you'll likely begin to notice what I have, that the process of imagining the stories that come from objects also seems to happen in reverse. The objects actually seem to become real, which in turn makes the entire story seem real. So this brings us to our fourth point. Using objects to make your fiction seem as if it actually happened. Now, this can be true in part simply because the more well-fitting details that you can add into your fiction, the more it will seem real. And I hope you can see at this point why objects make such wonderful details to add, because of all that they can accomplish. As we've seen, in one fell swoop, they can provide tools to travel through time, tell about a character, illustrate the passing of time, and it's really through doing all of these things that they make your fiction start to seem more real. So now I'm going to share my process with you for making sure that the objects in your novel are accomplishing all that it's possible for them to accomplish, especially in terms of making the world of your novel seem real. And we're also going to talk about how you can give an object its own story arc within the larger arc of your novel. So first, let's take an example, take a look at an example of an object that I used in my most recent novel, The Hidden Life of Cecily Larson, so you can see how it functions at nearly all of these objects. The Hidden Life of Cecily Larson is the story of Cecily, who at 4 years old is dropped off at an orphanage in Chicago by her cash-strapped, heartbroken mother, and at that time, her mother gives her a prayer card that says, "Hope begins with St. Jude." I'm going to read you just a little bit of that. Here, Madeline stripped off her new gloves and fumbled to open the clasp of the suitcase. "Look, I tucked in something from your daddy." She pulled out the prayer card on which was written, "Hope begins with St. Jude." Tommy had brought it home one night early on in their time in Chicago. Madeline had no idea why or where it was from, and leaned it up against the lamp on the dresser. More than once, she'd caught him gazing at it while he fastened his collar, as if he might actually believe praying to the saint could do some good. Madeline had scoffed every time, made terrible fun of him, in fact, and after he died, she'd pressed the card to her chest and told the saint how sorry she was. And deep down, she wondered if she'd prayed a little harder to someone or something or anything, Tommy might have not got killed. She didn't think Joe Teague would like the card one bit. Remember how I told you, Sissy, how this was one of your daddy's favorite things? She held the card out to Cecily, who took it in her chubby fingers and frowned down at it. So now that you've heard me describe how I think of and use objects in fiction, you won't be surprised to learn that the prayer card comes in throughout the novel, which spans 90 years, and that it holds different types of and levels of emotional significance for Cecily at various points in her life based on whatever's happening to her at the time. While she's at the orphanage, she doesn't have it with her. It's taken away from her. But on the day that she gets adopted into the circus when she's 7 years old, she finds it again. And I'll read you that section. Cecily grabbed her suitcase from where Mr. Tebow had set it this afternoon, then struggled to haul it up with her as she climbed the ladder to her bunk. Dolores and Flip were not going to believe this. Her bed was in a train caboose with a clown painted on its side, right under the cupola, so she could look out. She got on her knees to peer out the window, but all she could see was darkness, and all the sounds were odd and disconcerting. The clanking of chains and rolling of wheels, the crack of a whip, the bellow of some animal, the shout of a discontented man. It was a jarring thing to go from one life to another, all in one day. Cecily sank back down to sit cross-legged on the bunk, then unlatched her suitcase and opened it to take inventory in the dim light cast by the distant lantern. Her thin nightgown, 2 pairs of clean underwear, and a dress that Cecily had never seen before. That was all Mrs. H. had packed for her. Unless she'd slid a book into the side pocket? Not likely, but maybe Miss Oversham would have insisted. Cecily ran her hand through. No book, but she felt a small, thick piece of paper. She pulled it out, a card with a picture of a bearded man wearing a crown, plus the caption, "Hope begins with St. Jude." In smaller print was written, "The patron saint of lost causes." She remembered. Her mother had told her that this had belonged to her daddy. She didn't know how she could remember that when she hadn't seen the card in all the years she'd been at the orphanage, but she did. It seemed amazing that it was here, something from her daddy. She flipped it over. It said to pray to St. Jude in cases that were despaired of, impossible, hopeless. She sighed. She certainly was feeling all of those things now. Her daddy was dead for sure, and look how Isabel had reacted when Cecily had said her mother was coming back for her, like it could never, ever be true. Cecily felt tears welling. No, she told herself. No, she wouldn't cry. She lay down, squirmed her way underneath the covers, then looked at the card again, into the eyes of St. Jude. "What the blazes does prayer have to do with anything?" she asked him out loud. She'd never prayed to be adopted into the circus, and now here she was. She'd prayed and prayed for her mother to come back. And her mother never had. Sorry. So after this, as you can imagine, she places tremendous significance in the card for a number of years. And then at a certain point, she abandons it entirely, which lets the reader know more than anything where she's at emotionally at that point in the story. She says she is done praying for impossible things. When Cecily finally sees the card again after several decades have gone by, it becomes a symbol of things coming full circle in her life and of a type of restoration or even redemption. And one of the last lines of the book has Cecily saying that she never did stop praying for impossible things. So I'm not going to read that section because I don't want to give away the ending. But of course, I had the prayer card in mind from when I first started writing the novel. And I knew from the beginning that it would come in throughout. So I worked on it with it, even in the first draft. But in order to get the very most out of it, here's the process I used when I went back to edit the manuscript after it was finished. And this process begins by imagining that each object is, that the novel is a giant rug and each object is a thread being woven into it. I actually also use this technique when I work on each character's storyline, but I'm going to stick with objects here since that's what we're talking about. So the way this process works is this. When you're working on your revisions, you go through your manuscript focusing only on that one object. You ignore all other details this time through so that you're sure that the object has its own through line. You skip over chapters and scenes where it doesn't appear so that you don't get distracted by fussing over other details. And then every place where it comes up, you just make sure you're being consistent with how your character or characters view it, how they feel about it, and how it looks. And maybe you'll want to have it get worn out with time, for example. Or if it gets damaged at a certain point in the story, you have to make sure that that damage still shows up when the object next appears, and every time after that, unless it gets repaired, of course. And if the character's feelings about the object or how they look at it change or evolve over time, as they are bound to do, make sure that the changes and evolutions follow a path that will make sense to the reader. Another way to think about this is simply to ask yourself what the story arc for that object itself would be. And I advise, and what I do, is to go through your manuscript once for each important object in your novel. So, for example, in the case of The Hidden Life of Cecily Larsen, when I was working on the edits for that, I spent about 3 days or so just working on the prayer card thread, and then I moved on to the next object and spent a few days working on that. So what you'll be doing during that time is checking to be sure that every place the object appears works in terms of verisimilitude. And again, these are things like if it's damaged, let it show up as damaged the next time and not looking brand new. And also make sure that you're pulling all the emotional depth out of it that you can. Make sure that the thread is pulled and woven firmly through the entire rug of the manuscript. And when that's done, move on to the next object and test that thread to see if it holds too. Now, to really feel your way into how an object should function within a manuscript, take a moment right now to imagine an object that has had personal significance for you over the course of your lifetime. If there was a fire in your house, what would you risk your life to go inside to rescue? Why is that object so significant? Think of all the times it's affected your life, or all the times you've experienced the emotional connection to it over the years and decades of your life. Or even, how often do you think about it? Next, imagine how that object has changed or not over time. If it's gotten worn, if you've changed in how you feel about it. All of that is what comprises the story arc of an object and what intertwines human experience with an object's story. Now transpose all of that experience onto something that your character would experience, and you're just about there, because these intersections, when you pay careful attention to detail in order to create the utmost verisimilitude, work to create a feeling that the story you've written has actually happened. And once you make sure that your objects are experiencing their own real feeling story arc within your novel, aging or changing over time, plus intensifying and or illustrating your character's emotional journey, that will go a long way toward making your characters and the passing of time feel real and your fiction begin to feel like something that really happened. So as a final note on process, I'm going to close by giving you this checklist to assess how well the objects you're using as story details are working to make the world of your novel seem real. And I would suggest using this list as you're going through your manuscript, object by object, asking yourself, does each object in my novel age or wear out over time, if applicable? Does it illustrate in a deep way who my characters are? Does it illustrate or intensify my characters' emotional journeys? Does it illustrate or help accurately signify my novel's setting, being time and place? Does it have a journey or a story arc of its own, if that seems appropriate? And when you've done all of this with your objects, you can bet you will have written a story that feels real. I'll give you just a moment to see many of you are writing it down, which is awesome. And To finish up, I wanted to invite you, if you're working on a novel or hoping to write one, I'd love to invite you to join my online program, Start Your Novel with Confidence. The program comes with 3 facets: an online course, 1 year of coaching and community with me, and a package of bonus resources that give you everything you need to get your novel started off right. And that's the program. And the self-study course curriculum, which you complete on your own online, takes you through my process to start your novel in a way that sets you up for success. And this is the same process I used to start The Hidden Life of Cecily Larsen. It cut the time it took me to finish a submittable draft from 4 years on average, which was the time I took to write Keeping the House and my other published novel, down to 1 year. And by the time you finish this course, you will have written your first chapter, outlined your entire novel, made an easy-does-it bite-sized plan for finishing your first draft, and acquired essential mindset tools so you can persevere all the way through writing that draft. And that's just the beginning, because as I said, you get the 1 year of membership in my online program, including monthly calls and weekly Q&A with me to get all your questions answered as you go forward to write your entire novel. And you can learn more about it on my website, ellenbakerstudio.com. And with that, I want to say thank you and ask you if you have any questions. The slide with, yep. This one? Yes, of course. That's a great question. I think I use instinct, certainly, and what does each scene require? When I'm writing, I visualize the scene, and I really try to think about what's going on in the scene as if I were in that character's body. So, for example, when you think about Dolly, in that scene I read in the kitchen, that's a lot of objects in one scenario. I used a lot there because I was setting the scene. That was kind of the first time we really get to know Dolly. I wanted to include all the menu items and everything that really comprises her life and her home, which is so significant to her. Also because in that case, she's going to, over the course of the novel, become quite dissatisfied with her life. And so we have to kind of understand what it is that she's becoming dissatisfied with. So in that case, I used a lot. In The Hidden Life of Cecily Larsen, I think it comes down to sometimes to visual details. Like one of the details that I put in was a costuming detail for Isabel, who's the older woman who takes Cecily under her wing. She's a bareback rider also. And I was trying to figure out what kind of shoes bareback riders would wear in the late 1920s. And from pictures, I could tell it was kind of a ballet slipper. And I read about how beat up their feet would get. So when you're thinking about the character's physical experience, that seemed to me an important detail to include. And I have a scene where you can actually see her bruised, battered feet, which isn't an object, but the slippers and her costume are objects that are important just to like show her experience as a human doing the things she's doing. So I would say anytime you feel like an object can make, it really does come down to what do you need to make that character come to life? What do you need to make that scene come to life? So it's not a numbers game. It's more like a feel into it and feel what's right kind of a situation.
I was just gonna say, like, do you just pick like a couple that are super important that have their own arc?
Yeah, I mean, even, yeah, I think that's true. You do have to choose the most important ones to do the detailed work on. And I think you feel your way into that as well. Like the slippers didn't come back to be a really important thing, but the Cecily wears a tiara, which actually is so important. It ended up on the cover of the book because it signifies her performance and her taking on an alternate identity. And then at a certain point, she thinks about throwing it away, and then she has to leave it behind when she leaves the circus. So yeah, I think you'd use your instinct again to figure out which objects are the important ones. And in Cecily, it's the tiara, it's the card, it's a few like that that are really significant to like showing her character's journey. So I think ask yourself that question, like, is this important to my character's journey? Yes.
I was just wondering how you organized your material as you're writing. You, have a separate prop list or something that you work with? Because I have a setting list and a character list. But, do you?
Well, that would be a great idea. I tend to not use lists. I tend to, again, because I kind of am seeing the novel in my mind as I'm writing it, I think it's just so vivid in my mind that I just keep it all in there. And then, but what the, so maybe a list would actually help. Maybe I'll use that. But,
Maybe on
but
the editing end.
yes, certainly. And I think one of the things that a list would help you do is to not forget that, well, she should have that in her pocket all the time. Like if she has, and then you could make sure you bring it into a scene. Like say someone carries around a lucky stone, and it's always in their pocket, but then you've written most of the novel and realized you forgot the lucky stone, and then you've got to go back and put it in.
Or if you have a character who doesn't have a pocket, you've got to have something else to
Yes.
carry the stone in.
Yes, true. So that's where I think the thread thing helps catch things like that too, because if you realize that you've forgotten, like it should be in this scene, but I didn't put it in, like that's also a useful question to ask. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that being a museum curator helped you to see the value and importance of objects to people?
Yes, no question, because I got to see part of my job when I was at the World War II Museum. It was actually a museum that was brand new. It was being opened at that time, and it was in the early 2000s, so there were many veterans still living at that time. And I met so many people who, like, they knew they were nearing the end of their lives. They had carried this object with them their whole lives to signify their time in the war, and they wanted it to be preserved. So they would, with such heart, hand it over and tell me the story. So yes, it was life-changing for me to see the significance that people place in those objects. Yeah. All right. Yes, thank you. Thanks for being here.